თავდაცვის სამინისტრო სამხედრო პოლიციამ ცხინვალში რუსი მაღალჩინოსნების მანქანაში ოსი ეროვნების მოქალაქისათვის გაცემული დაახლოებით 2000 ცალი რუსული პასპორტი აღმოაჩინა. პასპორტების ნომრები არის თანმიმდევრული, თუმცა გაცემის თარიღი სხვადასხვა წლებისა. არც ერთ პასპორტზე არა მისი მფლობელის ხელმოწერა ჯერჯერობით უცნობია, როდის მოხდა პასპორტების ამოღება, თუმცა ცნობილია, რომ პასპორტები ახალი დაბეჭდილია და სავარაუდოდ კონფლიქტის ზონაში რუსი მოქალაქეების რიცხვის გაზრდისთვის იყო საჭირო.
In the town of Gori, tented camps are operating at full capacity. 6,500 people here, around 50,000 elsewhere in the country, still displaced by the August war. With winter approaching, there are concerns that people aren't returning to their homes fast enough.
Many of them, if not the majority, originate from the so-called buffer zone. For many, return home is really linked to a political situation of that area and to assurances and guarantees that the return is conducted in safety and dignity.
A real sense of security for people wanting to go home will only come when EU monitors arrive in the buffer zone and the Russians hopefully pull back. That could happen sometime in October. At least until then, or until people are sure that those arrangements have properly taken root, they're far more likely to want to stay here.
The Zerekidze family is among a small number only now arriving at the camp. They returned home a week ago to join grandfather Guram in their village 2 kilometers from South Ossetia. But the continued presence there of Russian forces and the fear of militia attacks has brought them back. Concerned mainly for the well-being of 2-year-old Elena, said to be terrified by the constant military movement. With the family safe, Guram is going home. He'd stayed in the village throughout the fighting and says he was severely beaten by South Ossetian fighters afterwards. His cow, an important source of income, he explains, needed constant looking after.
People are scared, very nervous. But what can we do? This morning a helicopter circled above us. My granddaughter was shaking with fear. So how could they stay there? I don't care about myself, but I do care about my little girl.
At the Russian checkpoint, a contingent of OSCE observers are turned back, but Guram's bus is allowed to pass into the buffer zone. The Russians have agreed to the eventual presence of EU monitors. Until then, they're keeping international eyes in this part of Georgia, including journalists, to a minimum. But we make it through. We find Georgian life in one village on the surface at least returning to normal. Talking to the people, though, there is an undercurrent of uncertainty. The otherwise lively alleyway reveals the burnt-out remains of Georgian homes. This woman used to live in one.
Some people say there could be another war. Others say the village could be bombed again. Because the Russian army hasn't withdrawn, we're all worried.
In some parts of the buffer zone, the returns have been quite high, but closer to the border of South Ossetia itself, far fewer Georgians have dared to venture back.
The Russian forces will eventually leave the buffer zone, and the time will come for Guram's family to rejoin him close to South Ossetia. But these people will have to accept the Russian presence across the South Ossetian and Abkhaz borders for years to come. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Gori. This is Lika Kekwashvili today, the 4-year-old pulled from the wreckage of her family home in Gori on the 9th of August. A week later, we found her in a specialist burns unit in Tbilisi, a child casualty of war with no one to care for her. Mother imprisoned, her father a heavy drinker.
Well, we've come back to find Lika once again, a month now after the Russian attacks that destroyed her home, that killed her brother and several other family members. Well, she's back in Gori. Her wounds are healing well, and we've discovered that she's been reunited with her parents, her mother released from prison by the government here just a week ago.
They're a family tenuously reunited. Dad's been absent for much of her life, and Lika is getting to know her mum again, released after 2 years in prison for stealing scrap metal. One son was killed in the attack, another died from eating scavenged food 3 years ago. A third son remains. Neither parent works, and they show little understanding of the traumatized Lika's particular needs.
I wasn't here, but I was told what happened.
She needs everything: medicine, clothes, money. She was very badly wounded.
Lika's wounds are healing. It is doubtful she will regain sight in her left eye, but the real damage is psychological, her aunt explains.
She often wakes up at night screaming, and it's hard to calm her down. She's scared of everything, day and night. She jumps when there are loud noises, and often sits by herself, saying nothing.
One international aid group is on the case. Save the Children first discovered the Kekuashvili family well before the war, when Lika's elder brother was found begging on the streets of Gori.
At this point, after all that's happened, after them being yet another time displaced, after the mother having gone through prison and all the previous disasters in her life, and the children being in a very difficult situation themselves, it will take time for them to readjust and to feel that they are safe and they are stable.
In the camps around Gori, there are other kids with similar needs. This is a psychosocial workshop for children suffering post-traumatic stress. Given time to readjust at home, Lika will be brought here too. Lika's story has been taken up by the local media here in Georgia. She's become a PR symbol of the war. As a result, the president signed her mother's release, and a local bank has offered to buy the family an apartment, a way out of this tiny room that they call home for now. For a 4-year-old, Lika's story is already a dramatic and tragic one. The August war has brought it to public attention. For the survivors of a broken family, a chance now perhaps for a new beginning. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Gori.
This is the route Russian tanks used to enter Georgia. Summer has now turned to winter, but Moscow's iron grip hasn't diminished. Its key strategic checkpoint on the de facto border is manned by both South Ossetian and Russian soldiers. It's a similar story in the heart of Tskhinval, where we found a Russian base. Troops, the Russians insist, are here to protect this new nation. For most of the world, though, this territory has effectively been annexed. South Ossetia may view itself as an independent state with its own parliament when they finish rebuilding it here, and its own rule of law. But there's no doubt this region is totally dependent on Russian money and Russian military might. The beleaguered administration of this region knows it's too small and poor to survive on its own. In an exclusive interview with Al Jazeera, the president insisted independence has made a difference.
Today, after Georgia's 18-year blockade and aggression, people have started to think about the future. They have really started to think about it, feeling more confident that this future will be peaceful.
A few kilometers from his offices, we found people less than confident about their future. This woman shows us the remains of her home destroyed by Georgian shelling. Her son had to be rescued from under the rubble. Her family has no choice but to live inside this small tent.
Look at where we're sleeping. How are we going to spend the winter? I don't know how we are going to survive. They're not giving us wood. They're not giving us housing. They're not giving us anything, not even a heater.
There's a strong belief here that only Russia can save them. Felix is a taxi driver who's lived through 2 wars with Georgia. He's one of thousands of residents handed Russian passports. For Felix and others here, independence means uniting with their powerful neighbour.
Russia will now help us, we will have jobs, and we will have a good life.
There are some signs of that already. This market closed during the conflict is now bustling with life. But the reality is these people are living in a political black hole. Reconciliation with Georgia is out of the question, and international recognition unlikely. Their only option, to turn to Mother Russia. Nazanin Mashiri, Al Jazeera, South Ossetia.
Here on Georgia's main highway, they're building for the future. When Russia and Georgia went to war in August, the fighting scared away foreign investors and caused a sharp economic downturn.
What's needed now, says the World Bank, is a huge injection of money to establish new infrastructure, like this aid-financed road.
In this stage of economic development of the country, we understand that the critical point is the infrastructure. Infrastructural projects are very, very expensive.
Many people in Georgia live in poor villages like this one. Here, the local clinic was also built with World Bank money. But the wartime exodus of refugees has put even more strain on the country's ramshackle social services, which are now desperate for foreign aid.
This kind of clinic is so important because this is a poor village and people can't afford to have expensive medical checkups or to get treatment before their conditions get worse. We have programs in the village through which people get medical treatment almost free.
Across the front line in South Ossetia, where the worst clashes took place, reconstruction is badly needed too. But this will be financed by Russian money after Moscow controversially recognized the tiny region as an independent state in the wake of a war which shattered lives on both sides of the divide.
One of Georgia's main hopes for boosting its economy was the increasingly lucrative tourism industry. But that has also been damaged by fears about instability and could take years to recover.
Streets like this one used to be full of foreign tourists spending their money in these fashionable bars. But when the war started, the tourists were evacuated, taking their money with them. And it's not clear how many will return.
Travel agent Ir Tabagari estimates that more than 90% of bookings have been cancelled, affecting hotels and restaurants as well as tour operators.
Some of them they will recover quite quickly as soon as everyone will consider Georgia a safe country, right? But for tourists it takes years.
The war also hit some of Georgia's poorest people hardest. Despite the global economic crisis, they're hoping the West will still be generous enough to come to their rescue. Matthew Collin, Al Jazeera, Tbilisi. A village close to South Ossetia, they're cleaning up the debris from the recent war. The fighting between Georgia and Russia only lasted a few days, but it will take demining experts many months to find and destroy all the munitions which both armies left behind. Hidden in a field just meters from where children play in the courtyard of the nearest house is an unexploded bomblet. It's one of many which was scattered by a cluster bomb when it fell, but failed to detonate immediately.
It has a outer jacket, the black casing is notched for fragmentation effect. So when it goes off, that will send fragmentation out. An anti-personnel role to kill or injure any personnel in the vicinity of detonation.
These bomblets now operate like landmines, with the power to maim or kill civilians for years to come.
In villages like this one where the fighting took place, the landscape is still littered with unexploded munitions. It's dangerous for some farmers to work in their fields. Some have been injured, and many have lost their only source of income.
It's very risky to go into the orchards. People lost most of their crops, and it was very difficult to harvest the fruit that did survive the war.
There are lots of unexploded bombs in our village. The children are afraid. Imagine, these children survived the war, and now bombs are exploding again. Everyone's afraid.
Despite substantial evidence, Russia has completely denied using cluster bombs during the war. Georgia has made a partial confession, but now seems to be hoping the issue will be forgotten.
No one here at the Georgian Ministry of Defence would agree to speak to us about cluster bombs. It's an indication, perhaps, that Georgia has been embarrassed by revelations that it used these controversial weapons. The ministry just referred us to this statement, which insists cluster bombs were not used in populated areas.
These rockets were never used against civilians, civilian targets and civilian populated or nearby areas during the conflict with Russia in South Ossetia region or beyond. The Gradlar system was used against Russian military equipment and armament marching from Roki Tunnel to Zara Road.
But the campaign group Human Rights Watch and a mine clearance organisation working in the conflict zone say that unexploded Georgian bomblets have been found in villages. They also say there's overwhelming evidence that Russia used cluster bombs during airstrikes, hitting populated areas.
Maybe the Georgians will say, okay, they deny this because they don't want to say that they have used those on Georgian villages, on Georgian territory. For the Russian, yeah, we know the Russians, so they will always find a good excuse and always deny these kind of things.
So far, neither Russia nor Georgia has signed up to the international convention banning the use of cluster bombs. For people in villages like this one, though, it's already too late. The land around their homes is now effectively a minefield. Matthew Collin, Al Jazeera, Georgia.
This is what's left of Evnevny, an ethnic Georgian village in South Ossetia. This is the first time Al Jazeera has managed to film this appalling destruction. Until now, access was limited by the Russian authorities. After 4 months of continuous pillaging, you'd think there'd be nothing left to take. But astonishingly, we found looters coming back for more. We approach a group of men. They just finished loading what appear to be metal frames. They're clearly not happy to see us. One man agrees to speak. He's from a neighbouring South Ossetian village. The Georgians who used to live here have gone, and he doesn't want them to come back. He admits it was the Ossetians who burnt the place down. He says he's not sorry about what happened here. This Caucasus region has a long, dark history of ethnic violence that flared up again during the Russian-Georgian War. Both sides accuse each other of human rights violations. It's still not clear exactly what happened in South Ossetia, as international observers haven't been allowed in. But around 17,000 Georgians used to live in the breakaway region before the war. A researcher from Human Rights Watch told me very few Georgians now remain.
I did find a couple of residents, but no more than 1 or 2 per village. Very few individuals who are so attached to their own homes that despite all the risk, and despite being like the only person in a completely burnt out village, they still stay in place.
But there were no signs of life here in Achebeti, another Georgian community just on the outskirts of Skinval. This burnt out shell is all that remains of what used to be a family house. This village, like many that we've seen here, is totally deserted. The Georgians who fled when the conflict started haven't dared return. The Ossetians are not only destroying all signs that Georgians ever lived here, they seem to be making sure they can never return again. Nazanin Mashiri, Al Jazeera, South Ossetia.
At the tent camp outside the Georgian president's office, the vigil goes on. Protesters say they'll stay here until Saakashvili steps down. They blame him for leading Georgia to defeat in last year's war with Russia. As the opposition blockaded his office, Mr. Saakashvili used a televised hospital visit to get his message out, suggesting the protests were being financed by his enemies in Russia.
As the events of the recent days showed, no matter how much money was spent, no matter what they do, Georgia is a stable country and it is not possible to destabilize it.
Like Saakashvili, most opposition leaders are pro-Western. They angrily rejected the suggestion they were doing Moscow's work. They insist they're financing the protests themselves.
We do not have to prove anything. The party that is making the allegations should be proving what they're making. But they're trying just to divert attention from what is happening here in Tbilisi, which is that this government is running out of power.
This latest row is another sign of how bitter this political dispute has become. Opposition leaders now seem to be waging a war of nerves to try to wear the Georgian leader down. But it's still unclear whether they have enough active support to maintain a consistent challenge. So far, the protests haven't turned violent or caused serious disruption here. The authorities may be hoping they'll simply fizzle out. But the opposition says it's ready for a long-term struggle. Matthew Collin, Al Jazeera, Tbilisi.
European monitors from the OSCE make one of their last patrols through the conflict zone. They arrived at this checkpoint to bid farewell.
The main thing today is just to say goodbye to you and your servicemen.
The OSCE is leaving while tensions are still high around South Ossetia, where last year's war was fought. Cemal and his family live just meters from the ceasefire line in the ruins of their house. They have no water, no electricity, no work and nowhere else to go.
Cemal says that when the OSCE monitors leave, they will feel even more insecure.
These people were supporting peace. They wanted to establish peace here. When they've gone, some kind of chaos will start again.
With South Ossetia now under Russian military protection, Georgians like Cemal are worried the forces which attack their homes are still positioned within shooting distance. From now on, the international community won't be able to monitor what's going on beyond this checkpoint in the conflict zone. With the two sides still facing each other across the ceasefire line, there are fears that this tense standoff could once again turn violent. Although international monitors failed to prevent last year's fighting, their departure will make it even harder to find a solution to the conflicts which have torn Georgia apart.
All these years, ordinary people have been suffering about the decisions of politicians and the lack of political will on the ground, and this is it. It's going to continue now, in the case of South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
United Nations monitors who used to patrol the conflict zone in Abkhazia are also leaving after their mission was vetoed by Moscow. As in South Ossetia, the Russian army will now control security here. In a heavily militarized area, with Russia and Georgia still locked in a bitter political dispute, this could be another ominous sign.
You have a lack of trust in general, a lack of a security regime. I think all of these things add up to a potentially explosive situation, unfortunately, which the West should be paying more attention to, and the world community should be paying more attention to.
European Union monitors will remain in Georgia, but they will also not be allowed to patrol inside South Ossetia or Abkhazia. For people living on the front line, like Cemal, that's just another reason to fear for the future. Matthew Collin, Al Jazeera, Georgia. Brand new settlements like this one were built all across Georgia in the weeks after the war to house people who fled the fighting. They're now a permanent reminder of the country's crushing defeat. Around 30,000 Georgians may never be able to return to their homes in a country which already had one of the world's worst internal refugee problems. Nanuli left her village in South Ossetia to escape the conflict, taking nothing apart from the clothes she was wearing. These photographs are all she has left of her old life.
From today's point of view, it's hard to have any expectations that we'll see our own house again. We just have no hope that will ever happen.
This Russian checkpoint is less than an hour's drive from the Georgian capital. During the war, Georgia didn't just lose the disputed regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, it also lost control of several other villages, like Akhalgori, which lies just beyond this Russian post. Russian forces remain there in violation of the ceasefire agreement.
The Russian troops in Akhalgori aren't harming us, but of course people are afraid of them. Their tanks make disturbing noises. People had to leave this area to get away from it, most of them elderly people.
With Russian troops still holding positions so close to the Georgian capital, fears have been raised about the possibility of renewed violence. The threat of instability has also damaged Georgia's fragile economy, just as it was starting to recover from years of post-Soviet decay. Foreign investment has fallen, construction projects have stalled, and tourists have been scared away, although the country has been boosted by a massive injection of foreign aid money. Despite several months of opposition protests, the Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili, has survived attempts to oust him from office. But financial hardship could still cause more discontent.
After the war, a lot of credits, they went bad.
Tamara used to work in a bank. She's just one of thousands of Georgians who've lost their jobs since the war.
There were a lot of people in the same situation as me, because I know a lot of people from the other banks who used to work in different departments, and they also lost their jobs. And it happened within days and hours.
A year after the war, many Georgians are still struggling to deal with the consequences. But despite the hardship and continuing uncertainty, they remain determined to survive. Matthew Collin, Al Jazeera, Georgia. High in the Caucasus Mountains, the last Georgian village on the road to the Russian border. The border crossing was shut when tensions escalated between Georgia's Western-backed government and the resurgent Russia, keen to re-establish its influence in the former Soviet Union. An important trading route became a dead end. Leo Serjashvili, who owns a small hostel on the road to the border, has suffered financially, like many others in this village. He says he's still afraid of the Russians, but he wants peace, friendship and mutual trade to start again.
When the road was open before, it was much busier here. There were more people. We were crossing the border and doing business over there. There was much more work back then.
The border post itself has been renovated with financial aid from the United States. It's another sign that Georgia isn't willing to give up the pro-Western orientation, which has angered Moscow. There are hopes that the reopening of this border crossing could help to increase trade between Georgia and Russia. But that doesn't mean that relations between the two governments are getting any closer or any less hostile. The Russian president says he wants to have friendly links with the Georgian people, but he refuses to talk to the Georgian leadership, which the Kremlin blames for the war and wants to see removed from office.
I'm not going to contact the incumbent Georgian president due to the fact that we have followed different paths and our assessments of the war are too different. I think President Saakashvili bears direct legal responsibility for the crimes committed.
The Georgian government, however, accuses Russia of occupying two parts of its territory and refusing to allow refugees driven out by the war to return to their homes.
Partial opening of the border does not mean that the relations are improving, because the occupation continues and the ethnic cleansing was not reversed.
The road may now be clear for traffic between Georgia and Russia, but the bitter dispute between these former Soviet neighbours is not over yet. Matthew Collin, Al Jazeera, at the Georgia-Russia border. Russian tanks have pushed deep into Georgia, and reports suggest that President Mikhail Saakashvili may have been killed. This primetime broadcast on a national television channel about a new Russian invasion sparked panic all across the country. Mobile phone networks crashed, and some people got ready to flee their homes. But the report wasn't real. It actually contained pictures from the war with Russia less than 2 years ago in an attempt to show what could happen again. Once people realized, fear turned to anger. Furious Georgians gathered outside the television studios to protest.
Just tell me, answer me, how this could have been done. This is disgusting.
When the situation is so tense, it is a criminal act to make jokes on these topics. And they should answer for that. Answer through the courts.
After the programme, the Georgian president's official spokeswoman rushed to the station to tell staff they'd made a big mistake.
The president sent me here to tell the television staff that when such a program is being made, despite the fact that our country is still subjected to certain threats, there should not only be a verbal warning in advance, but also a special on-screen banner saying it is an imitation.
The imitation news report has caused a nationwide scandal. But it's also shown that with Russian troops still holding positions an hour's drive from the Georgian capital, people here really do believe that Moscow could take military action against their country again. Opposition leaders who were portrayed as Moscow's agents in the program were quick to blame the government.
I can't imagine any normal country where things like that could be possible, where somebody could call you a traitor or agent of another country without any response. And I'm more than sure the Georgian people will make choice for stability, for unity of the country, for democracy, and for that we need to change this criminal, irresponsible government.
The program was intended to warn people in Georgia what could happen if tensions with Russia escalate again. But what it actually showed was that fear of another war remains very real indeed. Matthew Collin, Al Jazeera, Tbilisi. Hillary Clinton's arrival in Georgia sent out a simple message. The United States has not abandoned you. The US administration has been trying to improve its relationship with Russia, which defeated Georgia in a war 2 years ago and still maintains its troops not far from the capital. But Clinton immediately delivered the words that Georgians wanted to hear.
We continue to call for Russia to abide by the August 2008 ceasefire commitment signed by President Saakashvili and President Medvedev, including ending the occupation and withdrawing Russian troops from South Ossetia and Abkhazia to their pre-conflict positions.
Her statement clearly delighted the Georgian leadership, as did her support for the government's reform process and its pro-Western ambitions. President Saakashvili was effusive in his gratitude.
Despite the occupation and permanent external threats, we have robust and meaningful economic growth. Despite these challenges, we are pursuing our integration into the family of Western democracies, and we will never stray away from the path of profound democratic and social transformation. On this path, we know that we can count on U.S. assistance, support and leadership.
But at this American-style diner in the Georgian capital, there were concerns that President Obama's need to cooperate with Moscow over issues like Iran and Afghanistan meant the enthusiastic patronage this country enjoyed while George W. Bush was president was now fading.
Obama's presidency brought in a weaker foreign policy and less support for countries like Georgia. For the Obama administration, it's more convenient to have good relations with Moscow.
We hope that the US would take our side in a conflict with Russia, but at the same time we are aware that they play their own game, and in the end nobody is going to care about Georgia.
Clinton's visit to Georgia was part of a whirlwind tour of former communist countries, including Ukraine, Azerbaijan and Armenia. At every stop, she also stressed the importance of free speech and human rights, in a region where democracy is often under threat. After the recent resurgence of Russian power in the former Soviet Union, the United States wants to reassure its friends here that it's still behind them. That means, despite Washington's desire for better relations with Moscow, the struggle for influence here is not over yet. Matthew Collin, Al Jazeera, Tbilisi.
It was the decision Georgia didn't want to hear. The United Nations highest court said that because both sides hadn't attempted to broker a settlement to their long-running dispute before filing it, the case was out of their hands.
By 10 votes to 6, finds that it has no jurisdiction to entertain the application filed by Georgia on the 12th of August 2008.
Russia says it's satisfied with the decision. Georgia insists the dispute's far from over.
This is not the finish of this case. The opportunities are still open. We will comply with the procedural requirements defined by the court today, and the doors are open for us.
At the end of the brief war between Russia and Georgia in 2008, Tbilisi filed a complaint with the World Court. It accused Russia of murdering thousands of ethnic Georgians and displacing some 300,000 people. Georgia claims that over 2 decades, Russia launched a campaign of discrimination in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, both breakaway parts of Georgia. Tensions have been high ever since the provinces declared themselves independent from Georgia in the 1990s. But the recent war between Russia and Georgia has heightened those tensions even further. A war that Georgia believes has allowed Russia to gain greater influence over Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Today in South Ossetia, entire Georgian villages lie in ruins. Evidence, says Tbilisi, of the systematic drive to rid the region of all Georgian influence and prevent Georgians from ever returning. In Moscow's eyes, both South Ossetia and Abkhazia are now independent countries with firm loyalties to Russia. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera, Moscow. Georgian troops escort us deep into disputed territory. Tensions have remained high here ever since the 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict. As we approach the demarcation line, we meet Dmitry. His house was destroyed in the war. His land straddles the new divide. At the end of his orchard is a recently erected barbed wire fence built by the Russians to separate Georgia from the breakaway region of South Ossetia. Russian troops man the other side, visible through the trees.
This was the only source of income for my family and me. These Russians and Ossetians are too close.
In recent months, Russia has rapidly increased construction of the fence. Kilometers of wire now cut through communities whose people used to roam freely for generations. David Vanishvili's farm is now on the South Ossetian side. It's impossible for him to collect his Georgian paid pension without risking arrest. Georgia's invited foreign observers to witness what it calls a creeping annexation.
Our arrival here at the border coincides with the arrival of a top-level delegation of foreign diplomats and Georgian officials here to see the fence for themselves. Georgia wants all of its Western allies on side if it has a hope of winning this diplomatic tussle with Russia.
We reject this activity as a violation both of international law and the 2008 ceasefire agreement.
Condemnation has also come from NATO, an organisation Georgia's hoping to join.
Let me be very clear, the border runs along the Caucasus Mountains and not here, because the South Ossetia occupied Tkhinval region together with Abkhazia is a part of Georgian sovereign territory.
Russia says the fence is being erected legally after Moscow took administrative control of South Ossetia after the war. Moscow now recognises the region as a new country, but only a handful of Russia's allies support that claim. For Georgia, though, the region is still sovereign territory, and the new fence a line of occupation. These locals have seen war before. Another territorial dispute makes their lives here more uncertain. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera, on the Georgian-South Ossetian border.
Lest the world forget events in Georgia to commemorate war with Russia 5 years ago. An opportunity for Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili to again denounce Russian aggression.
The inevitability of the Georgian-Russian war could have been avoided only under one condition: if Georgia had become a failed state and given in to Russia's demands.
But that is a peculiarly Georgian version of events. Much of the world remembers things a little differently. Early on the 8th of August 2008, on Saakashvili's orders, it was Georgia that fired first. Following a spate of cross-border skirmishes with separatist fighters, Georgian rockets rained down on the South Ossetian capital. It provoked a furious response from Russia, whose forces had massed nearby, waiting for Georgia to make just such a move. Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev says Moscow was obliged to respond to Georgian aggression. Speaking on Georgian television on Wednesday, he said he'd do it all again. Russia defeated tiny Georgia with ease, but the 9-day conflict exposed weaknesses in the aging Russian military machine. Nevertheless, it had been a successful campaign aimed as much as anything at reinforcing Russian influence in the region. Western mediation had failed to force a Russian retreat, nor did NATO rush to Georgia's defense, something Saakashvili had counted on in a grand miscalculation. Russia would go on to recognize the independence of South Ossetia and neighboring Abkhazia. Georgian refugees will never return to their homes in the breakaway provinces, and 5 years on, thousands of Russian troops maintain a threatening presence on makeshift borders that remain in dispute. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera.